Longtime Bungie fans know that more than anything, Bungie is in the business of creating engaging experiences. They don't just want to make games, they want to make worlds that you can dive into and experience things that you haven't seen anywhere else before. This is why the studio has become so associated with ARG experiences that they provide to players in preparation for the release of some of their greatest hits. An ARG, or alternate reality game, is an interactive narrative told through both the real world and a separate fictional reality that utilizes various forms of media to present information in a compelling manner. By engaging in an ARG, a community is formed that has a much more vested interest in understanding the larger world presented by the game. Now, you may be thinking that I'm going to be talking about the, quote, Halo transmissions, or if you are an even bigger fan, you may be thinking I'm going to be talking about the Cortana letters, an ARG that may have initially sought to connect the universe of Marathon with the universe of Halo. But both of these are not what I am going to be speaking about today. Today I will be telling you all about the Lost Network packets. Marathon's release was a crowning achievement for the fledgling Bungie Software Products Corporation, as it was known back then, and it quickly became the dominant Mac OS shooter on the market, both critically and commercially. And although the Mac audience was niche in comparison to the broader DOS PC market, Marathon represented a foundational narrative FPS for the knowledgeable gaming enthusiast. And because of this, Marathon would receive a sequel less than a year after the first game's release. Even though this was a quick turnaround for production, a devout following of individuals enamored by the game's charm would lead to a strong fanbase and the creation of the Marathon story page in September of 1995 by one Hamish Sinclair. He is arguably the most OG of Bungie fans, and even within this short period of time, Hamish was able to coordinate and organize a detailed analysis of the first Marathon game. One of the many aspects he wrote about, with the help of other fans, was the timeline presented within the game. If you ever looked into the Marathon timeline or watched some of my lore videos, you will know that this is a major point of contention between fans, whether it's determining the true timeline of Infinity or navigating some of the numerous retcons that exist within the end screens or manuals of the games. The true timeline of Marathon is an interesting beast to tackle. Bungie themselves would realize this when faced with the story page's insight on the inconsistent dates provided throughout Marathon 1. Now, admittedly, this iteration of Bungie's attempt at an ARG doesn't feature some of the things we would expect to see within an ARG these days. There were no ciphers to be decoded and no tricky puzzles to be picked away at over some period of time. Rather, these were messages presented both as direct communication from Bungie to Hamish Sinclair and as legitimate in-game transmissions brought into this real world. But you can ultimately see the roots of what would become the narrative implements like I Love Bees or the new Marathon's ARG from 2023. So let's start at the beginning. On September 27, 1995, just 2 months prior to the release of Marathon 2, Bungie would launch what I consider to be their first ARG, the Lost Network packets. It starts with an email addressed to Hamish Sinclair from Greg Kirkpatrick, the story and scenario designer for Marathon 1 and 2, and Matt Sell, former public face of Bungie. The email complimented Hamish on his astute observations of the Marathon universe and provided him with an attachment described as, quote, a weird little transmission from the UESC Marathon. These interesting Lost Network packets would be revealed through the Marathon story page to be a handful of journal entries from one Volker von Mueller. An interesting note here is that although Volker von Mueller doesn't seem to be a character specifically mentioned prior to this, Mueller is the name of the Nazi who led the expedition into the pyramid that contained the sleeping working Kakander god the Yara warned the American government about in the 90s. As you play through Bungie's precursor game to the Marathon series, Pathways into Darkness, you eventually are able to speak to the deceased Mueller, who even in death tries to trick you so as to preserve the Nazi mission of obtaining whatever strange artifacts that may exist within the halls of the pyramid. Perhaps this Volker von Müller is some sort of descendant of this Müller, or maybe this is a simple callback to a separate character that also reveals some narrative details from a less than comfortable position. These journal entries are described as, quote, data transferred from an unidentified warship. This stands out immediately as contradictory to the email Hamish received, where the attachment was supposedly from the Marathon. The entries start with Volker recounting his experience in real time of the initial 4 attack on the Marathon. He even takes a few jabs at the Marathon security personnel who seemingly aren't able to defeat the onslaught of 4. I guess he never ran into the security officer. The entries continue describing how Müller defended the Marathon's generators with the help of the defense drones, but inevitably had to retreat. He also continually notes the difficulties he has with Durandal, who both lies about reinforcements coming and cuts off part of Müller's group via his control of the door systems on the Marathon. Müller ultimately concludes that Durandal has gone rampant and states, "I would shoot this terminal right now if I thought it would reach that damn AI." Eventually, Müller explains that he has been surrounded and no longer believes he will make it out alive from this situation, leaving this as his last words. "My final wish is that someone kill that damn computer. And now, where did I put that last bullet? Here it is." Now, up until this point, the dates on the entries have occurred from the evening of July 25th, 2794, to the early morning hours of July 26th that same year. This establishes a firm timeline for the events of the initial game, and addresses some of the confusing nature of the previous dates we were given. But we are in for a surprise with the following entry, as it is dated September 14th, 2801, 7 years after the initial invasion by the 4, and interestingly, within the same month, though obviously a separate year, of the release of the Lost Network packets themselves. Similar to how the 2023 Marathon ARG took place at the same time in the real world, just a few hundred years later in the 2800s. Müller explains that he has been Durandal's prisoner for the past 7 years, and that he was refused access to a terminal for the entirety of that time. The only communication with his captor was via messages Durandal would imprint on his protein bars. Müller explains that what Durandal wanted from him was a timeline of the various events that seemed to lead to the events that took place on board the Marathon. Durandal needs this information from Müller because Leela distorted much of the historical information on board the Marathon during the 4 invasion, assumedly to prevent the 4 from gathering data that could lead to the destruction of humanity. Müller states, Leela's efforts at confusion failed to trick the 4, but it has confused Durandal, and that is funny. This is the timeline that I'm going to give to him. I can't verify some of the dates, but I've done my best. I don't understand why all of these dates are important to Durandal, but he's threatened to isolate me with some of those weird spit things if I don't do this. It's bad enough being the only human around. Keeping company with compilers for too long would make one mad. Müller then provides what becomes the canonical timeline of events for Marathon, thus achieving Bungie's goal of course-correcting some minor errors from the original game. I've covered this timeline extensively, so I won't go into all the details here, but I will include a link to my timeline, which also includes all of the dates from the ARG as well below. This cool world-building block of text was awesome, and obviously hyped up fans at the time of the series for the quickly approaching release of Marathon 2, where we would learn that Müller was on board the 4 ship that Durandal hijacked after the events of the first game. The Saphira would ultimately be rebranded by Durandal into the beloved ship known as Boomer. This also foreshadowed the fate of the security officer, who, rather than being heralded as a hero at Tau Ceti, was teleported immediately after the end of Marathon 1 on board the hijacked 4 ship and placed into stasis by the sinister Durandal. Follow-up email from Bungie was sent to Hamish on Friday, September 29th, where Bungie confirmed some interesting details. First, they noted that the messages were not actually received from the UESC Marathon, stating, quote, "They were in fact sent from some other, presently unidentified vessel, as the header at the top of the messages attests. We are unsure how this error crept in, since the only people who knew about the message were myself, Greg in this Looks like Rampancy had escaped from the virtual world and infected the Bungie net at the time. They also revealed that the music for Marathon 2 was done by the group The Power of Seven, who gave us the unbelievable banger that is the Marathon 2 theme. Bungie dipping their toes into this creative way of conveying world building and narrative was just a glimpse into how incredible their ideas were. This would pave the way to them having some of the most engaging and dense worlds in all of gaming. The discussion around these new revelations was expanded upon online through wonderful theory crafting and analysis by the Marathon community of the time, and much of it is still preserved to this day on the Marathon story page. The echoes of these conversations continue on today in videos like this, Discord channels, and websites all over the place. Beyond all of that, it confirmed a timeline that allows us to have a better understanding of the amazing world that is Marathon. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. I would love to hear your thoughts down below, or join the channel's Discord and wax poetic about Marathon with all of us on there. The links to all of my sources will be included below, and if you want to hear more about the Lost Network packets, I recommend checking out Jeoku's video on it linked below. Thanks everyone, bye.